Welcome to the YouTube channel. Today we're talking about using PHP standards in WordPress. Now WordPress is the dominant CMS in 2022, and there's a reason for that. It's very flexible. You can build all sorts of different things with WordPress, and it has an amazing community of all different types of plugins. Now, these plugins range in depending on who's built them, and they're all very, very different. So it's a long-lived platform. There's lots of different stuff in there, and the standards are a little bit outdated. So how can you make your plugins more maintainable? How can you ensure that what you're making today will work in the future of PHP? Is it going to work in PHP 8, 8.1, etc.? Is it going to work in the future? Because WordPress was originally built on PHP 4 and 5, and now PHP 8 is very different. So what do we do, and how do we get to using PHP standards properly inside WordPress? So at MRK, we've gone through various different ways of building our plugins. All of them really led to some pretty bad decisions over the past few years. When we first started making our plugins, we were not using a PSR standard. Why was that? Well, it really came down to not being able to use Composer the way we wanted to within our plugins. And we came from a Laravel background into WordPress. So we were trying to do everything the Laravel way. We ended up using a thing called a pimple plugin, which was a container kind of class system. And it just became more and more confusing as we went on. That's really became messy. On top of that, our CSS and JavaScript was quite messy as well. We were using jQuery a lot, and we weren't using proper standards in CSS either, or in HTML. So what happened? Well, most of our commercial plugins are going through rewrites at the moment, as of the time of recording this, into our new standards, along with our CSS and along with making everything jQuery free. So you don't need jQuery at all to run an MRK WP plugin. That's a big change. And what we also found when we went over reviewing all of our code is when we had a bug, if somebody else wrote some code and another developer comes in, there was a lack of comments. So we've also introduced a standard for that as well. And all of these are based on the PSR standards from PHP. The results of our previous way of coding, doing something our own way, was our code was hard to maintain. It was hard to add developers to the team because there was a lot of training that had to happen. It's hard to add new features, and it became really hard to fix bugs. Overall, the whole thing was hard. So the answer is to create a better developer experience. That's what we're doing now within all of our plugins. We're rewriting our commercial plugins with these standards for that very purpose. How do we improve our developer experience? And let's have proven design patterns with the way that we go and do everything. And of course, have a documentation standard. By fixing that, we end up with much better plugins. So how are we going to do this? Well, at MRK, we started using PSR standards. So we've adopted some of the PHP stuff from WordPress standard, and we brought in PSR standards. And in particular, we're using PSR 4, the autoloader standard, and PSR 5, which is a draft documentation standard, also used for DocBlock and other tools within PHP. And finally, we're using Composer properly for our libraries and to include libraries into our plugins. And all of that, of course, we're covering in this video series. Important features of the WordPress standard. What are the important features that we use? One, open and closing PHP tags. In other frameworks, like I've seen it in Laravel, you have an opening PHP tag, but you never close your PHP. You just include that file. It's important in WordPress when you're coding things, open and close your PHP. Second is no shorthand PHP tags. Class names should be separated by underscores is the WordPress standard. We don't do that. We have camel case. That's the PSR 4 standard. The other one that we also brought over is closures. We avoid closures at MRK across all our code. Before we go any further, what is a PSR? PSRs are coding standards for PHP. They're not directly implemented by WordPress, but PSR allows all sorts of different libraries to be used. So PHP Fig is the website where all of these different PSRs are there. So a Fig is a framework of interoperability group, or a PHP standards group. So that framework is really just saying this is a way of coding that limits you to a certain way of coding things. Why is that good? Well, once you understand the pattern and the convention, you end up not writing all custom configurations all the time. And it means because we're writing things in one style, anybody can adopt that style and understand. So a PSR stands for a PHP Standard recommendation. Everything we're doing is a standard recommendation. It's meant to set a standard for your code. So the two PSRs that we primarily use here at MRK is PSR4, the autoloader. We do that for every single plugin that we build now. Every plugin, regardless of how complicated, always starts with the PSR4 autoloader. The second PSR that we use, PHP Standard, is PSR5. Now this is a draft standard around documentation. And that documentation helps us autocomplete things for our documents in VS Code. So overall, after doing all of this, what are the main outcomes I want you to take away from these standards? Well, primarily what we want to identify is that by using these standards, we get a core style of code that's easy for anyone to adopt into the future. Second of all of your plugins that you code and all of the code that you create as a developer will be easily understood by other developers who know the standard. And that means you can always say to any other developer, I'm coding to PSR4 autoloader. This is how I'm naming my files. This is the doc block standard, the comment standard I'm using. And they can look at everything and very quickly understand this is how I'm meant to code something. This is how I can add to this project. And this is how I can fix a bug in this project. Finally, using these standards means that you have a longer life of code because you've built to a standard to start with. It means that when you get updates to PHP 8 or 8.1 or 8.2, changing your code over to adopt those standards is going to be much easier because you've written to a standard. So that means that your standard slightly changes for the new version of PHP and you can easily go and fix all those errors instead of having to manually go through and test every function and say, I don't know how many functions will be using this standard that's no longer right and going to cause warnings for me. And I now need to go and adopt something. I have to manually go through every line of code, line by line. If we avoid those kinds of problems, then we end up in a much better place. So I hope you like this video. Keep watching the rest of this playlist as we go through PSR4, our standards that we do for building WordPress plugins, and how you too can make great plugins using these different PSR standards. All right, I'll see you in the next video.